It was on a dig in 2013 where archaeologists exploring a cave at the Red Sea harbor of Wadi al-Jarf uncovered a bundle of ancient papyrus fragments. It was the logbook of an Egyptian official named Marouard. These fragile 4,500-year-old pages turned out to be an extraordinary first-hand account from the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, describing in matter-of-fact detail how crews ferried limestone blocks down the Nile to Giza for the building of those great monuments. Talk about a remarkable discovery, offering a rare glimpse into the lives of these pyramid builders. And for centuries, the questions of who built Egypt's colossal pyramids has certainly been clouded by myth and conjecture. Did slaves toil under the lash to raise these monuments, as Hollywood once imagined? No. Could it have been advanced lost civilizations, as some other theories suggest? Also no. Well, we have archaeological science and ancient texts to thank for having a clearer picture of who built the pyramids. And it wasn't aliens nor slaves, but something more fascinating: the ordinary Egyptian worker. Those were the people who built the pyramids of the Old Kingdom. And today, we're going to talk all about them. So welcome to the channel. If you're new here, good to meet you. And for those coming back, good to see you again. And off we go on another Ancient Egypt video. But don't worry, you won't get interrupted. Whether you want to close your eyes and doze off or busy yourself doing other projects, you don't have to worry about ads on this entire channel, because we're funded by our patrons, our YouTube members, donations, and those who check out the merch store. That's how we keep everything interruption-free, as it should be. But if you want to support in another way, you're already doing it, because just by watching the content, that's enough for us. And if you want to go a little further, give us a like, subscribe, leave your thoughts down below, and hit the hype button, and perhaps tell a few of your friends. Always helps. But for now, let's get nice and comfortable, and we can talk about those pyramid builders. Well, let's start by saying that pyramid construction in ancient Egypt was overseen by a hierarchy. It functioned much like a well-disciplined army of laborers. At the very top were the high-ranking officials, and they were appointed by the pharaoh to direct royal building projects. The top job, no pressure. These were often elite individuals, highly educated members of the royal family, or at least close to it. They were entrusted with planning and engineering the monument. For example, during the building of Khufu's Great Pyramid in the 4th Dynasty, Khufu's half-brother Ankaf served as vizier and held the title head of all the king's works, effectively managing the entire construction on the pharaoh's behalf. Similarly, Khufu's royal prince and vizier Hemiunu, or Hemiwinu, is believed to have been the chief architect of the Great Pyramid. Now, as vizier, he was second only to the king, and oversaw all royal works by the pharaoh's decree. We see a tradition of such master builders even in earlier eras. The famous polymath Imhotep of the 3rd Dynasty, for instance, is thought to be the architect of King Joseph's step pyramid at Saqqara, history's first large stone pyramid. But these high officials can rightly be called pyramid builders too. Though they didn't hold the stones themselves, they directed the grand design, secured resources, and coordinated the massive workforce needed to realize the pharaoh's vision. And that's, while not as much as a back-breaking job, probably quite a mind-racking one. There's different kinds of work, you know. So, give them some credit too. In their capacity at the top of the hierarchy, those overseers planned the project and marshaled Egypt's resources to make it possible. They coordinated the quarrying and transport of materials, the pyramid's architectural design, and the scheduling of labor across seasons. Their involvement is recorded both in texts and in the prestige of their burials. Ankaf, for example, was honored with one of the largest mastaba tombs at Giza, and a famous bust of him was found there too, attesting to his importance. Now, just quickly, the mastaba tombs, they're not quite like pyramids. They're rather, maybe they're like the height of a one-story structure, perhaps, but they're quite rectangular and flat on top. Think of them kind of like a big shoebox, almost. There's a few of them around. Emunu's titles in his tomb inscriptions include Vizier and Director of Royal Works, reinforcing that he was the de facto project manager for Khufu. These men were the generals of the pyramid workforce. They issued orders, devised construction techniques, and solved engineering challenges. Because of their high rank, they had direct access to the pharaoh and could mobilize provincial governors and treasuries to support the building effort. It was under their supervision that the pyramid sites became beehives of activity, with thousands of workers and specialists all performing their roles in this coordinated manner. Beneath the top officials was a cadre of middle-ranking supervisors and skilled administrators, essentially the site managers, engineers, and foremen of the project. Ancient inscriptions from the Giza pyramid cemeteries reveal a rich variety of job titles for these people, indicating a highly organized division of labor. In the tombs of those who worked on the pyramids, we can find titles such as Director of the Draftsmen, Overseer of the Masonry, Director of Workers, Inspector of the Craftsmen, and even Overseer of the Side of the Pyramid. And of course, that's just to name a few. There's plenty more middle management roles. Each of these officials had a specific area of responsibility. For instance, an overseer of stonemasons would supervise the crews carving blocks at the quarry and finishing them, while a chief of the quarry would manage operations at the quarry site itself. An overseer of the side of the pyramid likely oversaw construction on one face of the pyramid, essentially acting as a sectional supervisor to ensure that the side rose according to plan. Such titles show an almost industrial level of specialization. And then there were the scribes. They were crucial too in this middle tier. Their job was to keep records of workforce attendance, distribution of rations, and progress reports for each team. These middle managers formed the backbone of the project's command structure. They relayed the high architect's instructions to the workers on the ground and reported on output or problems. For example, if the master builder decided to adjust the pyramid's design or needed more stone from a certain quarry, it was the scribes and overseers who would implement those changes by directing the appropriate crews. Their presence is so prominent that the upper portion of the Giza workers' cemetery, closest to the pyramids that is, was reserved for people of the highest status, carrying such supervisory titles. This arrangement suggests a chain of command, not unlike a military organization, where high officers delegate to captains and lieutenants, respectively the viziers and architects to the scribes and overseers, who in turn manage the rank-and-file laborers. And by having distinct departments, masonry, transportation, surveying, etc., the Egyptians ensured that each aspect of pyramid building was overseen by an experienced personnel, allowing for efficiency and quality control across this huge state project. Well, then there's the ordinary laborers, the builders, the haulers, the artisans, who physically cut, moved, and set the stone. They were organized into units known as philes. Of course, that's the Greek term for tribes or groups later noted by classical writers, and we're going to use it. So a phyle in the context of pyramid building was essentially a team or gang of workers that typically numbered on the order of a few dozen men. Several philes together comprised a larger formation, often referred to as a crew. This fractal organization, small teams within bigger ones, allowed thousands of workers to be managed in an orderly way. Both inscriptions on the pyramids themselves and recently discovered papyri provide insights on how these crews were structured and operated. Notably, the papyrus logbooks of an official named Marouard, who we mentioned in the introduction, found at the Red Sea port of Wadi al-Jarf, and dating to Khufu's reign, describe the activities of one such work crew in detail. Marouard's diary shows that his crew, called the escort team of Khufu, no, not that kind of escort, was about 200 men strong, and was subdivided into smaller philes of roughly 40 men. In the text, Marouard himself is titled as an inspector, which implies that he led one of these 40-man philes, and he mentions that at least 4 subgroups were under his supervision. Above the phyle inspectors was likely a superintendent or scribe coordinating the entire 200-man team. This mirrors the pattern suggested by archaeology at Giza. Long barracks in the workers' village seem to have housed units of about 40 men, each unit with its own supervisors and amenities. In the case of Marouard, a scribe or officer would compile the reports from each inspector, and then they would just communicate that up the chain. But what is interesting is that crews could be organized by trade or function. Marouard's team was composed of boatmen, essentially a specialized transport unit tasked with ferrying stone. His diary records how his escort team spent part of their year sailing to the Nile to transport Tura limestone blocks, the fine casing stones for the Great Pyramid, that is. They did this from the Tura quarries to the Giza construction site. This river journey from quarry to pyramid took about 2 to 3 days each way, according to Marouard's log, and involved navigating through canals to a harbor near the pyramid site. When not hauling stone for Khufu's pyramid casing, the same crew was reassigned to other state projects. Marouard notes that in the off-season his men helped build a harbor on the Mediterranean coast, and even undertook expeditions across the Red Sea. In fact, the Wadi al-Jarf papyri show Marouard's team transporting food and copper via the Red Sea, likely supporting mining expeditions in the Sinai Peninsula. This tells us that the phyle and crew system was quite flexible. Crews could be redeployed as needed, and their skills, whether sailing, quarrying, or construction, were utilized on multiple infrastructure projects for the crown. Within each phyle, there may have been further subdivisions, squads perhaps of 10 to 20 men who carried out specific tasks. For example, one squad digging limestone blocks out of the quarry face, and another squad hauling those blocks on the sledges, another mixing mortar, etc. Evidence does suggest that these subgroups sometimes had identifying names or were labeled by hieroglyphic symbols, denoting qualities like endurance or strength, effectively functioning like platoons within a company. Overall, a large pyramid project would involve several crews of a few thousand workers each crew split into philes, and those split into squads. By assigning entire teams to particular functions, quarrying, transporting, building, and rotating their assignments periodically, the pyramid project managers could keep the workflow continuous and avoid any bottlenecks. For example, While one crew was busy extracting stone in the quarries, another crew could be simultaneously hauling previously quarried stones to the site, and another setting them in place on the pyramid. The Philae system thus provided a modular workforce that administrators could plug into different jobs as needed, much as an army deploys companies and battalions. This enabled the Egyptians to mobilize labor on an unprecedented scale. Ancient records and modern estimates put the peak for the Great Pyramid workforce on the order of 20 to 25,000 workers at a time, not the 100,000 claimed by Herodotus, which is now thought to be either an exaggeration or a misinterpretation. And yet, they would maintain tight control over who's doing what on any given day, down to the very man. But here's something real fascinating for you. The workers themselves did not labor as anonymous cogs in that giant machine. They had distinct identities and even a sense of pride and humor about their work. And we know this because many of the pyramid stones and hidden chambers carry graffiti left behind by the work gangs, daubed in red ochre paint, usually in places that would be concealed once construction was finished. For example, on the backsides of the blocks or high in relief chambers where only builders would see them. These informal inscriptions often include the pharaoh's name alongside a nickname for the crew, suggesting the teams named themselves in honor of the project, or to boast of their camaraderie. For example, inside Khufu's Great Pyramid, above the king's burial chamber, 19th century explorers discovered markings referring to a gang called the Friends of Khufu. At King Menkaure's pyramid, the third pyramid at Giza, rival crews left their marks as, quote, the Friends of Menkaure, and the slightly more cheeky Drunkards of Menkaure. Far from being derogatory, the moniker Drunkards of Menkaure may have been chosen with a bit of bravado or jest. Maybe the crew earned a reputation for drinking their beer rations a little bit too quickly, and they immortalized it as a kind of badge of honor. Graffiti of this kind has been found in and around several pyramid sites. A list compiled by Egyptologists includes names like the Vigorous Gang, the Enduring Gang, the Sound Gang, the Boat Crew, and the Craftsman Gang, alongside with those explicitly referencing the kings, the pure ones of Khufu, those who know Unas, the kings of Unas of the 5th dynasty. Often these names were paired with an epithet of the pharaoh or a symbol. For example, one of Khufu's crews was called the Followers of the White Crown of Khnum Khufu, combining a royal honorific with the notion of allegiance. The presence of two or more different gang names on the same monument, say one inscribed on blocks on the north side and a different one on the south side, suggests a friendly competition among the crews. Archaeologist Mark Lehner notes that in some pyramid temples and subsidiary structures, one gang's name is found on one side while another gang's is found on the opposite, indicating they may have raced to finish their section first or took pride in outperforming the others. A spirit reminiscent of military units or sport teams, perhaps, where each group tries to excel and takes on a unique identity. But it's the tone of the graffiti, invoking friendship, vigor, or even jovial drunkenness, that paints this human image of the workers. It strongly contradicts the old notion that the pyramids were built by miserable slaves driven by whips. And as Lehner actually said, none of this sounds like slavery, does it? Yeah, good point. And indeed, coerced slaves would not likely band together and proudly call themselves friends of the king, or even take the time to record witty nicknames inside the very tomb they built. Instead, what these markings show is that the laborers had morale, solidarity, even a touch of humor in undertaking this enormous task. They saw themselves as contributors to a grand national project. They built it for king and country. and they found camaraderie in that shared purpose. This camaraderie may have been bolstered by the fact that many workers were recruited in crews from the same village or region, meaning they labored alongside neighbors and kin, which, well, that certainly makes things easier. In essence, the pyramid crews functioned much like companies in an army, each with its own banner or nickname, motivated not just by duty, but by pride in their work and team. But managing the logistics of pyramid construction was just as monumental as building the pyramid itself. The centralized state under the pharaoh took great care to provision and reward the workforce, which further supports the idea that these laborers were valued workers rather than expendable slaves. The scale of organization is evidenced by administrative records, like those found in Wadi al-Jarf Papyri, which include what are essentially accounting ledgers for the pyramid project. One fragmentary ledger from Khufu's reign was kept in two colors of ink: red ink to record incoming resources, revenues or supplies contributed by various provinces, that is, and black ink to record outgoings, such as rations paid out to the workers. In other words, the project had a bookkeeping system not unlike a modern balance sheet, tracking the flow of food, materials, and manpower. An official report from Egypt's Antiquities Ministry describes these papyrus documents as evidence of a highly efficient administrative system in Khufu's time. One papyrus document even lists in clear hieroglyphs the number of sheep delivered for the workforce, along with other foodstuffs. Such records tally with archaeological finds at the workers' camp. For example, animal bones in huge quantities have been excavated, and a recently discovered papyrus explicitly noted a shipment of livestock on the order of hundreds of sheep and goats, all going to feed the pyramid builders. So to appreciate the enormity of the provisioning, consider estimates from archaeologists. A workforce on the order of 10,000 would of course consume vast quantities of food and drink each day. Zahi Hawass, who used to be the top dog for Egyptian antiquities, I think he's retired now. He's still on Facebook though, you should follow him. Well, Zahi Hawass, who excavated workers' tombs at Giza, cites evidence that roughly 21 cattle and 23 sheep were slaughtered every day to feed the laborers building the Giza pyramids. And on top of that, grain had to be milled into flour for bread, and barley fermented into beer, in truly industrial quantities. Excavations at the Giza workers' village, often called the lost cities of the pyramid builders, have uncovered large bakery installations with rows of oven pits and bread molds, capable of baking thousands of loaves, and breweries that produced a thick, nourishing beer. Ration lists indicate that the basic daily payment for a laborer was given in bread and beer, staples of the Egyptian diet. In Merer's diary, for example, the crew's provisions included white bread, coarse bread, named hej and besen respectively, beer, and periodically meat and vegetables. One tomb inscription from the Giza necropolis, belonging to a noble who oversaw workers, has him proclaim, quote, "I paid them in beer and bread, and I made them take an oath that they were satisfied." Well, that's a remarkable statement that suggests an almost contractual relationship. The workers were compensated with rations in a manner that had to be deemed acceptable, implying pride in a fair administration. It also highlights that beer and bread were not humble fare but the standard recompense for labor, essentially the currency of wages in an absence of coinage. Ensuring adequate nutrition and supplies for the crews was critical for maintaining a motivated workforce and steady progress. The state mobilized resources from all over Egypt: grain from the Nile Valley, livestock from delta estates or pastoral regions, fish from the Nile, and copper tools forged from copper imported from the Sinai. The pyramid work, of course, was seasonal to an extent. Many laborers were farmers drafted during the Nile flooding when fields were underwater. But there also existed a permanent cadre of skilled workers who lived at the site year-round. For the temporary worker, the 3 or 4 month stint on the royal project was required not only with rations, but also with high-quality food. Evidence shows the workers had access to meat regularly, a sign of relative luxury for commoners. Animal bones found in the Giza settlement indicate beef and goat were common in the diet, and even evidence of cured fish and pulse crops has been found, suggesting a varied diet too. Logistics also included housing, the workers' barracks, water supply, and tool supply. The papyri include inventories of tools, and perhaps even note when crews moved on from one task to another. One document from Wadi al-Jarf, for example, records deliveries of hundreds of sacks of grain and dozens of jars of beer to the workforce, as well as accounting for shipments of limestone and copper. The centralized government planning behind this is unmistakable. Only a strong bureaucratic system could collect resources from across Egypt and redistribute them daily to thousands of workers, while also tracking progress on the build. This centralization was one of the reasons that the pyramids could be built at all. The project effectively nationalized a portion of the economy for decades, channeling the country's wealth into a single massive endeavor, but in return forging a more unified state. As one scholar put it, I'm less interested in how the Egyptians built the pyramids than in how the pyramids built Egypt. Very cool. Well, he basically means the process of organizing and feeding the pyramid workforce was itself a nation-building exercise. I suppose you can't argue with that. So all this evidence, and it is evidence, it coalesces into a clear picture. The pyramids were not built by slaves suffering under the lash, but by a mobilized workforce of Egyptian citizens working under a system of conscription or national service. Archaeological finds in the workers' cemetery at Giza strongly support this view. In the early 1990s, and again in 2010, tombs of the pyramid builders were discovered near the pyramids. These were modest shaft graves, containing the skeletons of laborers, buried with jars of beer and bread for the afterlife. The fact that these workers were given the dignity of a proper burial so close to the sacred pyramid of their king, a privilege that cost ordinary Egyptians great sums if purchased, is quite telling. The skeletal remains reveal that while the work was tough, many skeletons showed signs of arthritis, spinal stress, and healed fractures from heavy labor. The workers did have medical care. Some even had healed injuries and a few successful amputations, and a diet that was better than the typical peasants, i.e., they eat meat regularly. The workers' cemetery inscriptions even directly identify some occupants as servants of the Great Pyramid, and one epitaph of an overseer explicitly says he oversaw tomb builders and provides the quote about paying them in bread and beer. Such pride and care would have been unthinkable if the labor force were enslaved foreigners or a downtrodden upper class. Instead, it appears that the pyramid builders were a mix of skilled artisans, full-time laborers, and seasonal workers, who were all under the command of the pharaoh's officials. And this system does have parallels to a national service or corvée labor tax, where each household might send a worker for a few months. But those workers were compensated and respected for their contribution. They were organized, housed, fed, and even given time for beer breaks, hardly the treatment that slaves would receive. The friendly gang graffiti, the recorded competition and camaraderie, and the veneration of the workers in death all speak to a labor force that took ownership and pride in their work. And as Zahi Hawass put it, building the royal tomb was seen as a national project, one that likely instilled participants with a sense of identity and unity. Quote, "They were not just building the tomb of a king, they were building Egypt." Well, let's move on from that. Building a pyramid required vast ranges of crafts and skills, and while we often picture lines of laborers hauling the stone blocks, the reality is that a whole mini-society of specialists was there to support and execute the effort. So let's consider some of the trades involved. The core of any pyramid project was the army of quarrymen and stonemasons who extracted stone and shaped it. So let's talk about the quarriers and masons now. At Giza, the bulk of the pyramid blocks were limestone, quarried right next to the pyramid plateau. Teams of quarriers used copper chisels, pickaxes, and wooden wedges to cut the bedrock into manageable blocks. This was laborious work. Experimental archaeology has shown that a dozen men using hand tools can quarry a mid-sized block in perhaps a few days. The ancient Egyptians augmented their tools with clever techniques. For instance, hammering dry wooden wedges into cracks and then wetting them, so the expanding wood would help pry blocks loose. The rough limestone blocks were then dragged on sledges to the construction site, where skilled masons refined their shape, particularly for the outer casing stones, which had to fit together with knife-edge precision. Expert stonemasons dressed the limestones to a fine finish using stone hammers, grinding sands, and copper chisels that of course needed constant resharpening. For certain pyramids, granite and basalt were also used for lining chambers or for pavements. These hard stones came from quarries at Aswan, the granite, or in the eastern desert, requiring separate quarry expeditions and specialist teams who knew how to split granite using pounding balls of dolerite rock. We know from inscriptions that the Egyptians organized such expeditions. An Old World official named Weni recorded that he was sent to the quarries of the Elephantine and Hatnub regions to obtain huge granite and alabaster pieces for King Merenre's pyramid, even digging canals and building boats to ship those blocks downriver. Weni's account highlights the lengths to which the pyramid builders went to procure quality materials from afar, as well as the engineering ingenuity like canal construction employed to move these materials. Next, we have the architects and surveyors. Long before the first block was laid, surveyors and architects had to plan the pyramid's design with remarkable accuracy. The Old Kingdom builders were adept in geometry and astronomy, aligning the pyramid sides almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. They likely used sighting instruments and circumpolar stars, or solar shadows to find true north. Well, leveling the base may have been accomplished with a grid of water-filled trenches as a giant level. These tasks fell to specialists, which we might call engineer architects, often high-status individuals at court. Imhotep, the earliest known architect, was later deified for his design of Djoser's step pyramid. And little fact about Djoser's step pyramid, he never met his real pyramid, but it was good he had a pyramid figure in his life. Well, anyway, these architects, excuse me for that, that's a good joke, I like that. Well, these architects not only conceived the form and dimensions of the pyramid and its internal chambers, but also devised the construction methods. For example, the layout of ramps or the use of levers needed to realize the vision. They worked closely with the master craftsmen and foremen to translate the blueprints into action. Probably attached to the architect's staff were teams of draftsmen and surveyors who physically marked out the pyramid's footprint on the bedrock and continually checked that each level remained true and square. Artistic depictions from later periods of the stretching of the cord ceremony, to align foundations that is, have their roots in Old Kingdom practices. It was likely a dramatic ritual that commenced the pyramid building, with the architect and priest stretching a measuring cord in the presence of the king to sanctify the ground and ensure this cosmic precision. Next to the haulers and builders, the largest segment of the workforce, manual laborers, thousands of men who hauled blocks, mixed mortars, built ramps, and set stones in place. These were often the rotating workers drafted from the provinces. They needed not only brute strength, but also coordination. Moving a multi-ton block was typically done by placing it on a wooden sledge, and then dragging the sledge along a prepared causeway or ramp. Egyptian reliefs from later periods show that as many as 20 or more men might pull an object on a sledge using ropes, while another person likely poured water on the ground ahead to reduce friction. A clever trick, confirmed by modern experiments. You can try it yourself at home, actually. The Giza builders almost certainly employed long ramps to drag stones up the rising structure, possibly a straight ramp from one side, or a system of ramps that wrapped around as the pyramid grew higher. Constructing and constantly reshaping these massive mud brick or rubble ramps was itself a job for many laborers. We might picture crews of workers stomping in clay to form bricks, porters carrying baskets of earth, and bricklayers extending the ramp as the pyramid gained height. Meanwhile, other teams were raising blocks into the final position. They could lever them up tiers or used inclined planes. Either way, coordination and physical effort were paramount. Foremen likely chanted instructions or rhythmic calls to synchronize the hauling. The workers used simple but effective devices, for example, wooden levers, rollers under sledges, and perhaps ropes and pulleys, all managed by experience and teamwork. One striking aspect of the pyramid construction was the movement of materials. The builders took full advantage of Egypt's Nile River and canal systems to transport heavy loads. Quarry stones, especially in the fine limestone casing blocks from Tura and granite from Aswan, were shipped by boat to the building site, sparing much overland hauling. Merer's diary, for instance, describes his crew sailing limestone blocks downriver to Giza in just a few days via the Nile, and a man-made harbor or canal that led straight to the plateau. Archaeologists have indeed found evidence of a port at Giza's edge, an inland basin where boats could dock near the pyramids, confirming that shipments of stone and supplies arrived almost at the construction doorstep. Pretty convenient. You don't even get that from the modern Amazon delivery drivers, don't you? They knock once and then run away. King Sneferu and King Khufu also established remote infrastructure for resources. They developed ports like Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea to launch expeditions to the Sinai, obtaining the rich copper needed for tools and bringing back other exotic materials. This integration of riverine and maritime transport with the on-site labor was a logistical triumph, with ships and barges carrying tons of stone and provisions on each voyage, and canals dug to navigable points, as an official like Weni boasts of cutting channels through the first cataract to float granite blocks. The Egyptians created a supply line that kept the pyramid works fed and equipped. The efficiency of this transport network was such that even enormous obelisks and temple columns could be moved hundreds of kilometers by water, a feat that astonished later classical observers. By marrying waterways, roadways, and human muscle, The pyramid builders mastered logistics on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world. Next, we have behind the scenes. Carpenters and tool makers kept the machinery of construction going. Carpenters built the wooden sledges that carried stone blocks, as well as the large wooden rollers, levers, and scaffolding used on the site. They also fashioned boats and barges for river transport. Indeed, some of the very cedar ships that transported granite blocks away from Aswan may have later been dismantled and buried around the pyramids. Toolmakers and smiths, on the other hand, provided and maintained the copper implements essential for working stone. Copper was relatively soft and would blunt quickly, so smiths at the pyramid site were constantly resharpening and reforging chisels and drill bits. Archaeologists excavating the workers' town have found remains of copper slag and crucibles, indicating that metalworking was done on site to recycle broken tools. Additionally, flint knappers made flint chisels and blades for finer work, and rope makers twisted the miles of rope needed for hauling and lifting. The procurement of raw materials for tools was a vast enterprise in itself. For example, the state organized mining expeditions to Sinai's copper and turquoise mines to ensure a steady supply of metal. The toolmakers thus stood at the nexus between mining, transportation, and the day-to-day work on the pyramid, ensuring that the laborers never lacked the tools needed to keep progress on schedule. But just as critical were the scribes and bureaucrats who managed the whole operation. The Marouard Papyri illustrates the role of scribes in charge of record-keeping, noting how many blocks were delivered, and how many men were present, and what supplies were dispensed. Large construction projects had entire accounting departments, well, so to speak. Scribes would record deliveries of stone from various quarries, log the disbursement of grain and beer to the workforce, and tally the days worked by each gang. Some of the Wadi al-Jarf papyri are indeed such accounting records, registering tools and provisions. One fragmentary document mentions days off and rotations of crews, implying that management tracked labor schedules closely. Bakery and granary accounts would be kept to measure how much bread and beer was consumed, and when to requisition more from state reserves. These records not only kept the project running smoothly, but have also allowed modern historians to appreciate the complexity of pyramid administration. Every aspect, from the number of fish delivered for dinner, to tally the fresh recruits arriving from certain villages, would be noted on papyrus or wooden boards by diligent scribes. Without this literate, numerate class of administrators, the pyramid projects could easily have descended into complete chaos. But instead, what we see is astonishing order. Even wage payments in rations were centrally tracked. A sense of pride likely infused the scribal class as well. They were key facilitators of the pharaoh's grand design. Many of them went on to have their own modest tombs with titles like Scribe of the Royal Project inscribed forever, indicating that serving in the pyramid works was a respected and career-defining role. Next we have the support workers. A pyramid worksite was like a bustling town, and required all services of a town of thousands would need. Excavations around Giza's pyramids have unearthed the living quarters and facilities for the builders, sometimes called the Lost City of the Pyramid Builders. Here were not only sleeping barracks and houses, but also bakeries, breweries, kitchens, granaries, and even the cemeteries for the workers. The diet of the pyramid builders was pretty good by ancient standards, likely to keep morale and strength high. Huge bakeries with rows of clay ovens produced tens of thousands of loaves of bread, and large vats brewed a thick, nutritious beer from barley and emmer wheat. Archaeologists examining animal bones found in the workers' trash heaps were astonished at the amount of meat on the menu: cattle, sheep, and goats, pretty good variety. And based on bone counts, well, it's estimated that the workers at Giza were consuming cattle at the rate of perhaps 20 to 30 per week, providing beef for protein, along with the already aforementioned numbers for sheep and goats. But of course, a cow is much larger than a sheep or a goat. In any case, it's a diet far better than that of a typical peasant. I'll tell you a little story. One time I bought half a cow meat for my family, and I was kind of shocked to see how much I got. We'd bought a goat before and had that butchered, and we ate that for about 2 months. So I thought, we'll get beef this time, and oh dear. Talk about biting off more you can chew. We had to go to our friend's house and put half of it in their refrigerator, well, their freezer. Yes, it took about half a year to get through that. Still plenty of meat for everyone. In any case, moving on. Well, fish from the Nile and Delta marshes also supplemented the meat, and garlic and onions, the very foods that Herodotus mentioned, were used to flavor the meals and provide a few more nutritious benefits. To supply the city of workers, the state mobilized deliveries from all over Egypt. Herds of livestock were sent to Giza, and vast quantities of grain were shipped and stored in enormous silos. Indeed, the infrastructure at the site included silo complexes capable of storing grain for months, ensuring that bread and beer could be continually produced. Support personnel like butchers, cooks, and water carriers were on hand as well, and washers to launder the garments, cobblers to repair sandals worn out by heavy labor. Pretty much everything you could need. And then medicine. That was another critical support service. Injuries were pretty common when you were dealing with multi-ton stones and heavy tools, and the remains of workers tell a story of hardships met with care. In the cemetery of the workers, located to the south of the Great Pyramid, many skeletons showed signs of healed trauma. We've already mentioned the broken bones that were set and healed straight, the amputations where patients survived for years after losing a limb. But there was even evidence of trephination, a surgical intervention opening the skull, with survival, believe it or not. One skeleton belonged to a man whose leg had been crushed by a heavy object, possibly a stone, and it was amputated. He lived for perhaps 2 more years, indicating he was cared for and fed during his injury. Another has traces of a healed skull operation. This implies that physicians or trained healers were stationed at the pyramid site, ready to perform emergency treatment, and they likely used herbal remedies, splints made of wood and linen, and basic surgical procedures to treat the wounds. The overall health of the workers gleaned from their bones suggests that they were generally well nourished. A few showed signs of severe malnutrition, but suffered from arthritis and joint stress due to constant strenuous activity. The presence of female skeletons in the workers' cemetery, some possibly nurses or wives of workers, hints that a community of caretakers was part of the support network. And finally, there were the families and communities of the workers. While many of the laborers were young men drafted for a season, excavations show that workers' villages included not just barracks but also more permanent houses, where overseers and perhaps year-round skilled workers lived, possibly with their families. Accommodations in the pyramid town reflected status. Ordinary laborers slept in austere galleries, long barracks where dozens of men shared space on a raised mud brick platform, whereas officials and master craftsmen had separate mud brick houses with courtyards, kitchens, and private rooms. Archaeologists, for example, have uncovered remains of an overseer's residence complete with a reception hall and sleeping quarters, indicating that even on the work site, those of higher rank lived more comfortably than the rank and file. Some women who attested in the settlement likely serving as bread makers, textile workers, and perhaps caregivers. The cemetery of the pyramid builders contains not only men, but women and children, implying that a whole community lived around the site. But it is certainly difficult to get an inside sense of what life was like during the Pyramid Age, but archaeology certainly provides us with a few glimpses. So just imagine dawn at Giza. The light spreads over the desert and illuminates the half-finished pyramid, and those tents clustered nearby. A horn sounds, or overseers go round rousing the sleeping laborers. Soon, thousands of them are up and about, some lining up at communal hearths to receive their morning ration of bread and beer, others gathering tools and assembling at their assigned work zones. Throughout the morning, the plateau is alive with the sounds of construction. Teams of men chant in unison as they haul sledges loaded with stone, their voices helping to keep the pullers in rhythm. Whenever a sledge reaches the foot of the pyramid, there's a flurry of coordination. Levers are wedged under the block, and with concerted heaves the stone is pried onto the first tier of the rising structure. On the pyramid itself, skilled masons and setters await each block. They apply plaster or mortar as needed, and slide the block into its precisely measured spot. A cheer might go up when a particularly heavy block, say one of the granite monoliths for the king's chamber, finally thuds into place after hours of effort. Over by the workshops, the clink of chisels and mallets ring out as artisans smooth the casing stones to a gleaming finish. Carpenters repair a broken sledge, or construct a new sled for an especially large stone. The smell of baking bread wafts from the bakery precinct, where workers assigned to kitchen duty are busily feeding the ovens with fuel and sliding doughy loaves in to bake. By midday, the sun's hot and high, and a break is called. The labor gangs retreat to whatever shade they can find, the side of a ramp or the shelter of a barracks roof, and they eat their lunch of bread, onions, maybe dried fish or dates, washed down with hearty beer. A few jokes are exchanged, and a little rest helps sore muscles recover strength. After the rest is done, the work resumes, though perhaps at a slower pace in the early afternoon heat. Still, the project has to stay on schedule, and no one's allowed to slack off. A pharaoh's pyramid should be finished before his life ends, so the overseers drive the teams to keep up the pace. Some crews might rotate tasks to avoid exhaustion. A man who spent the morning dragging stones might spend the afternoon fetching water or mixing gypsum plaster, while another takes his place on the ropes. In some instances, if the pyramid construction is in a particularly intense phase, like setting the capstone, work could continue nearly round the clock, with torches and firelight guiding night shifts. However, for ordinary days the sun sinks toward the western horizon and things begin to wind down. Tools are gathered up and stored. The ramps and quarries fall silent. The workers trudge back to the camp, sweat-stained, dust-covered. Evenings in the workers' village are lightly held moments of camaraderie and relief. Many would wash off the dust in the waters of a nearby basin or canal. Communal meals were probably taken, large pots of stew or bread porridge shared around the fire. Some workers might seek entertainment. Archaeological finds of game pieces suggest they played board games, either senet or mehen, or they gambled with throw sticks and knuckle bones. Storytellers could regale the camp with tales of the gods and legendary heroes, or perhaps exaggerated boasts about their own feats. In quieter corners, scribes might be compiling the day's records by lamplight, and foremen could be planning tomorrow's assignments. There may also have been moments of devotion, a small shrine in camp, where workers offered prayers to Bes or Taweret, or even to the deified King Djoser or Imhotep for good fortune. Evidence of such spiritual life is pretty sparse, but given Egyptian piety, it's likely that even laborers found ways to honor the divine amid their work. Periodically, the monotony of building was broken by grand events. When a pyramid's construction reached completion, the king himself might appear for the dedication of the capstone. We have hints from later inscriptions that, at least in one case, the king and his workmen together pulled the pyramidion, up, that is the capstone by the way, up a ramp to crown the pyramid's peak, followed by celebrations. And you can certainly imagine the celebration at the end of years of toil, when Khufu's Great Pyramid was finally finished. Possibly a grand feast was held for the workers, complete with extra rations of meat and beer, music and dancing under the stars next to the monument they had built. In such moments, the pyramid builders could see tangibly what their labor had achieved, transforming the skyline with a mountain of stone that would house the king's spirit for eternity. That knowledge, and the honor they earned, perhaps made all the aching backs and calloused hands feel worthwhile in the end. And speaking of the end, we have reached it. So thank you very much for listening today, tonight, this afternoon, this morning, whenever it is in your part of the world. Maybe you can let me know where you're listening from. Maybe. In any case, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. We have Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfinir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Corsi, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun, 101, Brandy, Pesty Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gale, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demonstow, Mason, John, and Magenta. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I will see you whenever you're back. You know where I'll be. And thank you again for listening. Good night. Love to you all, and farewell for now.